Rugby is at it again. The sport that loves tinkering with its rules is doing just that once again. A lot of you would have seen yesterday law changes coming into the game, some that are going to be voted on, some possible trials, and some things that maybe might happen in the future. A whole mixed bag for you, but I thought it was probably worth a video. Let me know what you make of all these in the comments section. Like the video and subscribe to the channel and all that sort of stuff, but I'm really intrigued to see what the reaction is to this. A lot of what I've seen on social media, it seems to be fans saying, why are they tinkering with it again? They're always tweaking and changing this. And I understand that. I can understand those frustrations. It does feel like, particularly over the last few years, there's constantly been shifts between different rules and things changing and all that sort of stuff. I also think it is important to be able to do that, to try and make the game as good as possible, but does it always make the game better? Maybe, for example, the dropout from the goal line from teams being held up might be an example of whether that rule change has actually been a positive or not. So welcome back to the channel. Let's get into it. As I say, there's some various different things to go through, some immediate law changes, some possible law changes, some possible trials, and areas that they're going to look at further in terms of things that might change in the future. But let's get straight into it with the immediate law changes. Referees to call use it and start their 5-second countdown at rucks earlier to avoid caterpillar rucks. I think this is something that broadly people will be in favour of. You might remember, I can't remember exactly when it was, a couple of years ago, they were a lot hotter on how quickly the scrum halves had to use the ball, but it was one of those things that there was maybe a couple of weeks, a month, a few months where that was a focus, and then slowly it dissipates and we're back to where we were. So I like the fact that they need to just implement that better. Interesting to me that they aren't flat out banning caterpillar rucks, that they're just going to try and speed it up and force the scrum half to use it earlier to prevent them from actually being able to set it up. I wonder whether that leaves a gap in there, that if teams get themselves really organised, they could still set up a caterpillar ruck and be able to use that tactic. I would have expected maybe for them to try and just ban it outright, but exactly how they word that rule might have opened a different can of worms for how many players you can have in an attacking ruck and whatnot. So generally speaking, implementing the 5-second countdown I think is something that is a positive. I am interested that they haven't just flat out outlawed caterpillar rucks. Hookers must maintain a full break foot by putting 1 foot forward at scrums to aid their stability. Seems to make sense. It's a safety issue, not necessarily a huge issue, but maybe something that isn't being enforced as much as it should. And then a crackdown on water carriers entering the field. This has been something they've been trying to get to grips on for a while. There's been different iterations of this rule. They put it down to, or they at one point had it where it was twice in a game, or there were certain stoppages they could come on. They then changed that so that water carriers could also come on after a try as well. It's ultimately to stop coaches, isn't it, being able to actually get on the field of play. We saw it in that final round of the Six Nations with one of the Wales coaches having a conversation with the referee, and he then subsequently wasn't allowed to come back on, I think, after that, which was good because the manner in which he approached the referee wasn't exactly what we want to see. Yeah, I don't really have a problem with it, in all honesty. You don't want them coming on the pitch all the time. It seems a little bit clunky to me of quite when they can and when they can't bring them on. And I don't exactly know in terms of those law changes what that crackdown is going to mean. When can they come on? When can't they? How do they implement that? But again, broadly speaking, I don't have a real issue with it. Possible law changes. They're going to vote on these later on in the year. Closing the DuPont law loophole by tweaking the offside rule from kicks to reduce kick tennis battles. I'd imagine if you've clicked on this video, if you're a big rugby fan, you will know what we're talking about here. The rule that Antoine Dupont was best at trying to exploit, really, where he realised he could stand still in front of the kicker, and as soon as the person catching the ball had either passed it or run 5 metres, you're then able to try and charge them down. It is one of those things that, yeah, well done, you found a loophole, but it is worth closing. I wonder what they'll close it to. That's probably the more interesting thing for me on this. Do they go back to where players that were in front of the kicker either have to be taken over by a player that was behind the kicker or the kicker themselves before they're onside? I never really had an issue with that rule, to be honest. So we'll see how they close it, but I think it's a positive thing that they are closing it. Remove the option of a second scrum when a free kick is given at a scrum. So this is one of the more contentious issues, I think, in particular amongst the South African fans and amongst the Springboks, where they've got such a dominant scrum. there against this. And I can understand it really, because the scrum is an integral part of the sport. And yeah, I know we lose time to them when they're having to be reset. It's frustrating, which is why one of the things I'll come on to in a minute, I think is a positive in terms of timing it and maybe having a countdown like we do for penalties and conversions. But stopping scrums from happening completely, I'm not in favour of. I think it's such an important part of the game. It's such a unique area of rugby union in terms of the specialist abilities that are needed for scrums. Key component of the game. And the grey area for me with that would be, well, what if a team who is clearly a weaker scrummaging team almost deliberately gives away a free kick to prevent them having to scrummage and potentially give away a penalty, and then the free kick they've given away, teams aren't allowed to then call another scrum from that. It seems like it's an area that could be exploited, and I think ultimately scrummaging is such an important part of the game, although, as I'll get onto in a second, maybe it could be sped up, we need to look at that. But overall, I don't like the idea that you can't call a scrum from a free kick. That's my view on it. Outlawing the dangerous crocodile roll at rucks, one of those ones that why hasn't that been closed sooner, in all honesty? Been an issue for a while. I know the Rugby Players Association, loads of other people have been saying this needs to be stopped quickly. Seems like it finally will be. Surely that will get voted through and will be a positive one. On to the possible trials. So this is where it is, a shot clock for scrums and lineouts. I think, on paper at least for me, that does make sense. Stopping teams from slowing the game down when they're getting to their lineout, and also hopefully speeding up the scrum, as I say, in terms of the parts of the scrum that can often eat up time on the clock. Exactly how that works, I think, would be interesting. For example, does it happen? Does the timer start the moment a player knocks the ball on? Does the timer start when the players from either side are ready to go? I guess it would probably be that. Exactly how it works, you probably need to be looked at. But I quite like the idea of the shot clocks. I think they need to make them more prevalent actually on screens and advertising hoardings and that sort of thing around the stadium. And actually, I think for penalties and conversions, it should be the same amount of time, 60 seconds for both. I don't really get why one's 90 and one's 60. But a shot clock for scrums and lineouts, for me, yeah, I quite like the idea of that. Ability to mark the ball inside the 22 from a restart. This is one of the ones I am most against. Do we need this? Does this make sense? I was trying to rationalise what's the reason for this. And the only thing I could think of was it means that hopefully teams will kick to compete from restarts more. They will kick in between the 10 and the 22, looking to go up and compete for the ball rather than always kicking it long. But I'm not convinced that will happen enough. And for me, all it would do is turn restarts into the ball always being marked. Because if you were the team receiving it, if it was in your 22, why wouldn't you mark it? Because most of the time, all teams are looking to do is set up a couple of phases, a phase or two, and then clear the kick anyway. Why wouldn't you mark it? Give yourself more time and space to then do your clearing kick. And ultimately, restarts are then sort of null and void, unless you're kicking to compete. Maybe at the end of the game, you're chasing it, you need a score, and you have to win the ball back. But I think for the most part, all we'd see is teams kicking long, the team receiving it, marking it, kicking it into touch, and then we finally get play underway with that line out. I don't quite understand why we need that. Am I missing something? It doesn't seem to be an issue whatsoever. And actually, I think restarts are a really important part of the game. Like you hear it said, don't you, that they are the third set piece or fourth set piece or whatever people say for an area of the game that are absolutely crucial. You have to get your restarts right. How often do we see it? A team scores and then they muck up the restart, they give away a penalty, and it allows the opposition back into the game. I just feel like this is watering it down, and I don't understand the reason for that. So I'm against that. Next up, the ball must be played after the maul has been stopped once, not twice. Now, this is something I would be massively in favour of, because I've felt for ages, and I'm surprised that nothing has ever been made more of it, of how long teams are allowed to keep the ball in the maul. And how long actually it takes a referee to say once and then twice. That's perhaps more of my issue. So perhaps the law change actually that I would rather see would be that once and twice gets called quicker by referees. I think a lot of leeway, too much leeway, gets given to the attacking teams. I'm in favour of them having dominance and having an opportunity to attack when they get momentum driving forward. But to me, too often it seems like teams are given the luxury of having an absolute age to get their maul going. In that you can set your maul, it can take a bit of time to really get moving, but you're still given that opportunity. I think if you don't get it moving quick enough, you should be forced to use it, in my opinion. I wonder whether I'm going to be in the minority there, but that has been something that I've felt for a little while. I wouldn't necessarily have worded the rule change in this way, but overall I am in favour of it. Further protection of scrum halves at the base of rucks and scrums. Again, is this an issue? I feel like scrum halves are pretty well protected anyway. And I think it's a really good area of the contest as well. And it requires quite a lot of guile and skill from scrum half sometimes to be able to get the ball out of there. I guess what they're trying to do there is give cleaner, quicker ball so that the game flows better. Again, I'm just not entirely sure that they need more protection. To me, you're then going down the route of what we see in like football and protection of goalkeepers, where you can barely go near them. You can barely touch them if they're in and around a ruck because you're going to get penalised. I'm not sure we necessarily need that, but maybe that's just me. This is a great one, and another one which, how on earth has it taken us this long to get here? Play on if a line out is not straight, but the throw is uncontested. People have been saying this for so long. How often do we see it? That they throw in at a line out, the ball is not straight whatsoever, but the opposition haven't even gone up to contest it, and then you have to reset with a scrum, or it's a free kick. Just let them play on. I think that's a great one. All right, areas for further analysis. Possible global trial of a 20-minute red card. This is one of the more controversial areas. And I think this is actually one of the areas that there is more of a cultural divide between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. This is massively being pushed and lobbied by the Southern Hemisphere. And so the idea is 20-minute red card, and then the player that was red carded obviously can't come back on, but the team can make a substitution. And I think it revolves around the premise that red cards ruin games, which I would contest massively, because I just don't think that's the case. Alex Lowe, in a piece in the Times today, which you should all go and check out, had a great piece about the stats behind international test matches between Six Nations teams and Rugby Championship teams, and who has gone on to win a game when a team has been red carded. And actually, it wasn't a case that all the time the team with the man advantage goes on to win the game. It was actually quite the opposite. So I'm not really in favour of this. One good counter argument, actually, from the Southern Hemisphere could be the whole point of seeing more red cards for high tackles, which is what the bulk of red cards are for these days, is to change player behaviour in the tackle area and to make them tackle lower. A good counter argument to my argument would be, actually, these rules haven't changed that. Players aren't changing their behaviour. But even so, for me, I personally wouldn't be in favour of a 20-minute red card. I don't think it's necessary, and I don't think red cards ruin games. Could probably do a whole video on that, but I'll leave it for now. You guys can have your comments. A big safety review of the breakdown, possible removal of the jackal. I find this such a tough one. So the breakdown is obviously an area where it is a really dangerous area in the game. A lot of injuries do happen there because of the angles of players' bodies and the speed at which players are arriving at the breakdown. I get it. Again, I feel nervous about the removal of the jackal because I feel like that is such an important part and a unique part of the game. What are the unintended consequences of getting rid of the jackal? What does it do to the breakdown? What does it do to the flow of the game? That, again, is something that I feel a bit uncomfortable with. So I'd be against that. I'll be interested to see what the further analysis of that does throw up. A review of the role of the TMO. I think most fans will be massively in favour of this. The TMO is a great part of the game. It does seem to be like they get involved too often. And sometimes you feel like the TMO is there in the background trying to find absolutely anything to be able to pull the play back. And without going down the football route, which is a can of worms in itself, you feel like it needs to be something that is really significant that has been missed, rather than marginal 50-50 calls, which it sometimes is, that needs to be flagged to the referee. That's my view on it anyway. A review of how and when the replacements are used. I don't have a problem with this. I don't have a problem if a team wants to bring on 5 forwards all at once in the second half. If we were having a discussion about the amount of replacements, maybe that might be different. I'll be interested to know what the kind of data says around that. But a review of how and when replacements are used, again, that's one of those ones, you know, when South African fans feel like certain law changes are geared completely towards them. And I don't buy into conspiracy theories like that. I can understand why they feel that way with something like this. I don't really get it. I don't get why we need that. And then finally, possible introduction of a lower tackle height for the elite game. That is potentially the biggest change for rugby union in the professional era, which has been brought in amateur levels here in England, your Saturday leagues, your Sunday leagues, where you have to tackle, I think it was below the sternum, was it? I can't remember exactly. But you guys will know, tackle low and not being able to tackle upright. I think there's a good chance that comes in. I just don't know. I understand why they're trying to do it. I'm nervous about that. I'm nervous about what that does to the game. But what does the analysis they've done show? I mean, as a few of these I could speak so much more about, but I am reticent for the lower tackle height. And you hear a lot of ex-pros speak, and they often say that the more dangerous tackles are the tackles around the hip and the knee area. So I guess they're trying to get rid of that head-on-head contact. But that's a huge, huge potential change for the sport. I'll leave it there. Video's already up to about 16 minutes anyway. We could go on and on. Comment down below. Let me know what you make of those different ones. That is just my brief thoughts on all of them. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.